Well, welcome everybody. Oh, can you hear me? Is that loud enough? Wonderful. This is a great turnout. Thank you all for coming. So hello and welcome to our presentation this evening, Eerie Muncie, Tales from the Dark Side of Local History 3, or the Trilogy as we're calling it. I am Sara Allison, the head of archives, user engagement, and archives and special collections at Ball State University Libraries. And I'm happy to welcome you this evening. For our followers on Zoom, I just want to make sure that they can hear us okay. So if someone can type into the chat very quickly that we're good to go. We are good to go. Okay, so this program is being hosted by the EB and Bertha C. Ball Center, and it is a community collaboration with the Ball State University Libraries, Delaware County Historical Society, and the Muncie Public Library. The panelists and I would like to thank Diane Waters, Associate Director of the EB and Bertha C. Ball Center, for collaborating with us to bring Eerie Muncie 3 to you in person, because we haven't done this actually. All of our community presentations have been done on Zoom. So it is really great to be back in person. So, oops, let's see here. So before we get started, we do have some announcements. Our presentation this evening, along with the question and answer portion, will be recorded and will be made available through the Ball State University Library's digital media repository. Like I said, there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. If our followers on Zoom would like to ask a question during that time, you can use the chat box. The button to access the chat is located on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. When using the chat, please make sure that the to field is labeled to everyone. This way, all participants and the hosts in the in-person session can see the question. Also, too, we have a bit of a disclaimer. This program includes content that is meant for a mature audience, as it contains disturbing content. You know, it's our dark tales. So it's really meant for a PG-13 audience. So let me get started by doing some introductions. I already introduced myself, and I will be the moderator for the presentation. But this evening, we will be hearing from Melissa Gentry, who is the supervisor in the GIS research and map collection at Ball State University Library. Sara McKinley, who is the local history and genealogy supervisor of Muncie Public Library and manager of the Carnegie Library, and Karen Vincent, who is the Delaware County historian and the president of the Delaware County Historical Society. So as I said, this is our third Eerie Muncie Tales from the Dark of Local History. We started this series in 2022 during the height of the pandemic to bring some local history to our communities. We have talked about murder, mayhem, and UFOs. Over the last 2 years, we have heard the following dark tales, such as Robert's Hotel Ghost Florence, Harriet Mitchell Anthony, and the Eaters of Sand, which was an interesting one. The tragic story of Lavinia Black, who was put on trial for killing the man who had raped her. Told you, dark tales. The haunting story of Pearlie and Wimpy, the mysterious bodies found at Muncie Central High School. The epidemic of heroin and opium that affected women during the gas boom. The UFO sightings around Muncie and Delaware County. The appearance of a Ball State t-shirt in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and a connection to Heaven's Gate. And we have also taken a tour around the state of Indiana with a monster mashup that included the monster of the Devil's Lake, Hoosier werewolves, and the wild turkeys of Muncie. So if you missed any of these other dark tales of local history, they are available in the digital media repository at Ball State for you to watch on Halloween night. This evening is no different. We have a ghost story, murder at the Ball Brothers factory, and stories from Muncie's red light district. So to get this Halloween haunt started, we are going to start with Sara McKinley.
All right, thank you, Sara. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll go to our first slide here. So tonight, despite the title, I have a ghost story, not from Muncie, but Muncie adjacent, just west of Muncie in Yorktown, about a haunted house and a headless horseman. The mythical figure of the Headless Horseman, which was usually depicted as a man on horseback who is missing or carrying his own head, comes from folklore dating back to the Middle Ages. It was passed down through the centuries in multiple pieces of literature. In American folklore, it was popularized by the 1820 tale of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, and perhaps this inspired tonight's tale. Our story comes from a newspaper article published in the Indianapolis News on November 2nd, 1901, titled Tale of a Hoosier Haunted House, which I discovered on the Hoosier State Chronicles website hosted by the Indiana State Library. It begins with Indianapolis newspaper correspondent William Henry Blodgett, shown here on the left. Known to some as Billy Blodgett, he worked as an investigative journalist for the Indianapolis News and traveled all over Indiana to uncover stories of corruption, crime, and sometimes the strange and unusual. He had a particular interest in Hoosier folklore. One day, while playing cards with a fellow newspaper correspondent named Dick, Dick asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" Mr. Blodgett replied he hadn't met any ghosts that he believed in, but he was ready to be convinced. At this time, Dick began to spin a tale about a house near Yorktown with an eerie story connected to it. A man had supposedly both shot himself and cut his own throat in the house. And according to the residents of Yorktown, the house had ghostly visitors and strange happenings ever since. He said, quote, "This unquiet sleeper from the grave is supposed to come back and make noises in the house. And a headless horseman taking the shape of a dim, gigantic ghost is said to gallop about the barn lot and prance along the road until he disappears in misty nothingness." Well, this was enough for Mr. Blodgett to be intrigued, and they soon set out for Yorktown to see the haunted farmhouse for themselves. Mr. Blodgett described the house as being located on a 160-acre plot of farmland, seemingly cut off from the rest of the world on the National Road, which is State Road 32, between Yorktown and Daleville. This is an image that they identified as the farmhouse in the article. When Blodgett and his friend arrived on the property, they found the house partially hidden by a small grove of locust trees that cast eerie shadows on the white, moonlit highway. The windows on the upper floor of the farmhouse were dark, while bright light shone from the ground floor windows and doors. Prior to his visit, Mr. Blodgett had alerted the house's current owner, Gus Burgess, that they would be visiting. The Burgesses were happy to have the house investigated for ghosts. They were actually accustomed to such visits and found them amusing. When Mr. Blodgett and Dick approached the house, they were greeted by Farmer Gus Burgess, his young wife Molly, and their 6-year-old son, Harold Payton, shown here in the photo on the left. And as a quick little factoid, in case you're wondering why Harold appears to be wearing a dress in this photo, this was actually common practice up until the early 20th century, in which they dressed boys in dresses or gowns from about ages 2 through 8 until they were fully toilet trained and could easily unfasten breeches or trousers on their own. So little Harold was considered unbreeched at this age. So that's your fashion history factoid for this evening. After welcoming in their guests, the Burgesses confirmed the story told to Mr. Blodgett. Yes, legend was that a headless horseman could often be seen galloping just north of the old farmhouse on Tuesday nights. Why specifically Tuesday nights was never explained, but I guess the ghost had a schedule to keep. He was thought to be the ghost of Dr. Slack, who was misidentified in the article as Cyrus Slack, but his actual name was George. Dr. George Slack was a famous country physician who had lived in the farmhouse and supposedly met a gruesome, tragic end. The Burgess family had experienced strange things while living in the old doctor's home. They claimed to have heard groans coming from the upstairs room and things rolling over the floor, people laughing, or footfalls on the stairs as if someone was coming down them, but no one would ever appear. They also sometimes heard spectral violin music coming from inside the house when no one was playing. The door between the dining room and kitchen would swing open at all hours, no matter how many times they tried to fasten it shut. A kitchen cupboard where the old doctor used to keep his medicine would also swing open until Gus Burgess decided to take it completely off its hinges. He said, "I'm done with it." A previous occupant of the house, Bill Fuquay, claimed that he saw the ghost in the living room and opened fire at it with his gun several times. Gus showed Mr. Blodgett the bullet holes that were still in the wall. Another former occupant, Tom McKinley, only lasted there a day before promptly moving out. He couldn't stand the noises he heard, and he claimed he saw the apparition standing in the kitchen. So how did Dr. Slack die, according to the legend? The story was that Dr. Slack was a well-known and successful doctor who had accumulated a great deal of wealth, but his mind grew unsettled in his old age. One cold night, he went out into the yard and shot himself, but the wound was not fatal. With the blood still pouring from his body, he went into the house and up the stairs to a small room in the northwest corner and slit his throat. The blood from the second wound pooled into the floor, and still he survived, dying later in the hospital. But everyone believed his spirit returned to the farm. Grabbing a lantern, Gus led Mr. Blodgett up a dark, narrow, twisting stairway to the second floor into the room in question, which was currently being used for storage. A crowd of curious neighbors who had heard of the investigation followed them up the creaking staircase. The storeroom smelled damp and was filled with spiders who had taken up residence in the corners. After moving an old mattress and some carpet, Gus pointed to where the bloodstains and 2 bloody boot prints from Dr. Slack could still be seen on the wooden floor where he staggered against the wall. Much like the story of the Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde, noticeable efforts had been made to scrub and scrape the stains away, to no avail. Mr. Blodgett then noticed a strange white substance floating in a pan of water nearby. Gus explained it was rat poison. He claimed the attic was full of rats, but curiously, he and his family had never seen them, only heard them skittering around on the upper floor. As they followed the crowd of neighbors back down the staircase, Mr. Blodgett asked Gus about the Headless Horseman and whether there was any truth to the stories. Gus confessed he'd seen the horseman often, and as with Bill Fuquay's story, he and others had shot at the horseman, but never seemed to hit their target. He said the phantom horse was dark in color, much like the one the doctor rode, and that the figure riding the horse was thin and misty in appearance, but had no head. The old barn that was on the property when Dr. Slack was alive had since been torn down. But when Bill Fuquay lived there, he reportedly had trouble getting his horses to go into the old barn at night, and the barn doors would sometimes fly open on their own. Now, the apparition seemingly comes up out of the ground where the barn once stood, or appear on the road in front of the house. During this time period in the early 1900s, we'll remember that both horses and cars commonly shared the roads. Locals reported that sometimes their horses would react to the ghost, while others reported seeing the apparition ride his ghostly steed past them while they were driving their cars. But whenever the horseman got very far from the farmhouse, he would disappear. Though the locals were convinced of the ghost's existence and would avoid driving past the farm at night, the Burgesses saw no reason to be frightened. Gus said the ghost couldn't hurt anyone, and so as long as he knew no harm would come to them, he wasn't afraid. Still, he was curious what it all meant. The men went outside to get some fresh air and wandered around the farm, heading down to a boggy swamp on the property before returning inside, where Dick performed card and coin tricks for little Harold. Mr. Blodgett and Dick were allowed by the Burgesses to stay as their guests in the house overnight, hoping to see a glimpse of the ghost themselves. The lights were turned down, and Dick stayed in the guest room bed while Mr. Blodgett stayed on the easy lounge. They brought a lantern with them that could be quickly lit in case the ghost appeared in the night. After they had both fallen asleep for a while, Mr. Blodgett was suddenly awakened by an unearthly sound, choking, gurgling, and gasping, then a muffled call for help. Quickly shining the lantern towards the bed, he saw only his frightened friend sitting upright. He shouted to ask him what was the matter, to which Dick replied, "He must have had a nightmare. He thought the Headless Horseman was chasing him and had made him jump over a high cliff before a man in white tried to cram 3 fingers down his throat." The rest of the night was uneventful, and the only strangeness that occurred was Dick's awful nightmare. As they walked down the road the next morning towards the interurban station, Mr. Blodgett turned to ask Dick what he thought of the noises in the house, to which Dick replied matter-of-factly, "Rats." So there ends Mr. Blodgett's tale of the haunted house and the Headless Horseman. Now, I did some research into Dr. George W. Slack, and while I can't confirm the story of how he died, as newspapers from the year he died did not survive to be microfilmed, and a death certificate could not be located. But I did learn that he was born in Pennsylvania, February 13th, 1825, and came to Indiana when he was 12 years old. He graduated from Rush Medical College in Chicago and became a practicing physician in Yorktown, where he was widely known and also had a reputation for being an authority on agriculture and horticulture. Dr. Kemper wrote of him that he was, quote, a Christian gentleman of the highest type and was remembered fondly by the community. I did find his gravestone pictured here is located in Yorktown Cemetery and that he died January 10th, 1886, just 1 month shy of his 61st birthday. His probate records shows that his son Etheridge Slack was the administrator of his estate. George actually owned many pieces of land in the Yorktown area, including this plot shown on an 1887 atlas of downtown Yorktown. Becky Monroe, who's here tonight, of the Yorktown Historical Alliance, actually gave me a driving tour of Yorktown, and she showed me the maps and abstracts related to this plot of land, which was in her family for 35 years. However, the farmhouse described in the story tonight, where Dr. Slack died, was further west. We were trying to figure out where the farmhouse was located, and after looking at deed records and plat maps, I found that this is our closest guess so far. The article describes it as being on the National Road, close enough that the lights from the house cast shadows on the highway. I don't know if you can see my cursor at all here, but the gold winding line is the National Road or Highway 32. The house was a mile or so from Yorktown and about 3.5 miles from Daleville. So Yorktown is up to the northeast where my green arrow is pointing. Daleville is down to the south where the yellow arrow is pointing. So it's somewhere on the National Road between Yorktown and Daleville. It was farmland in the Kilgore neighborhood, a 1/2 mile from Pikes Peak Schoolhouse. Well, the Kilgore neighborhood is all of the purple triangles highlighted here. This was all land owned by the Kilgore family. Pikes Peak Schoolhouse, I think there was a mistake with that because Pikes Peak is all the way down to the south here, right by Daleville. I think they were actually referring to Schoolhouse number 6, which was in the Kilgore neighborhood. The plot of land was 160 acres. Well, George Slack actually owned the blue rectangle here. That was his 160 acre plot of farmland. And the north section of that square are 2 farmhouses just next to the National Road, which I've circled in red. So I'm pretty sure that his farmhouse was there along the road. So this is a close-up of that. The 2 little dark blobs on the right were 2 houses just off the road, which is actually the intersection of Highway 32 and Priest Ford Road, if you're familiar with that curve there. On the left side here is a satellite view of that same area. So the spot on the left still has a house standing there, but it doesn't look like Dr. Slack's farmhouse when I looked at it. The spot on the right is actually gone and is now farmland. So in the end, we don't believe the Slack farmhouse is still standing, but we know it's located just off of Highway 32, likely near Priest Ford Road. Whatever the case may be though, Dr. Slack's haunted farmhouse and the Headless Horseman were at least a local legend at one time in Yorktown, possibly long forgotten now by most until tonight. Perhaps Dr. Slack's spirit is finally at rest, but if you're traveling down Highway 32 on a Tuesday night, just perhaps you might see a glimpse of the Headless Horseman riding across the moonlit fields. Now I'm going to turn things over to Karen Vincent, who is going to talk about murders at the Ball Brothers factory.
So several years ago, while I was still, while I was still working at Minitrist, I was going through a collection of early 20th century Muncie correspondence and Muncie newspapers. And as I quickly skimmed through the newspapers, the headline, "Workman Killed in Cold Blood," from the Muncie Evening Press of Thursday, December 23rd, 1920, just popped out at me. Why hadn't I heard about this incident at Ball Brothers Company before? My colleagues in Minitrista's collections department hadn't heard about the murder either. So what was going on? I was curious, so I delved a little deeper into this story. Yeah. That'll do it, thank you. I always need help with the technology. While doing so, I found another story of murder at Ball Brothers. 2 murders in the factory at Ball Brothers. Obviously, workplace violence is nothing new. The first story began in August 1915. By all accounts, the first victim, Frank Deem, who was 40 at the time of his murder, was an upstanding citizen and one of the most popular employees at Ball Brothers Company, where he was foreman of the Sure Seal room. Upon his death, he was survived by his wife, Ethel. So why was Dean stabbed to death on the afternoon of August 6, 1915? It all started that morning when Dean caught John Craig, 17, and Earl Hopper, 19, who both worked in the Sure Seal room, shooting a game of craps. And a side note on this, their ages varied from newspaper article to newspaper article. We do know that they were either in their late teens or early 20s, but it changed in every single article. The 2 had been warned about idling on company time, and when Dean caught them, he promptly fired them. Now, accounts of the next 6 to 8 hours vary, but the main gist seems to be that Craig and Hopper went to get their pay between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m., but left without it and without causing any trouble. They returned approximately an hour later, and when they returned, they demanded and received their compensation, but they said that they had been shorted by 15 hours. Dean ordered them out of the factory, but they refused to leave and started advancing toward him. Dean backed up toward a barrel of glass in which there was a length of pipe. In some stories, Dean, it was said, grabbed the pipe before he was intact, while in others it said he wasn't able to get to it. What does seem certain is that Hopper struck Dean with his fist, causing him to stagger backwards. Craig grabbed at Dean, and the 2 fell to the floor with Dean on top. Craig then pulled something from a pocket. According to the newspaper account, witnesses say they saw Craig striking quick, sharp blows at the stomach and chest of Dean. At each blow, Dean winced and his hold on Craig untightened. 6 blows were struck before Dean sank down on the floor beside Craig. John, or in some accounts, William Newell, one of the witnesses, ran to Dean's assistance. He said, "When I unbuttoned his shirt, my hand was covered with blood. Then I called out to the others in the room to catch Craig. When I said that, Craig started after me holding the knife. Newell jumped over a low wall and got away from Craig." Dean died within a half hour of being stabbed. By then, Craig and Hopper had walked out of the room, through the factory, and out to the street and went their separate ways. Then the manhunt started. According to one newspaper article published the day after the murder, police had no way to chase the men. Remember, this is 1915, since the department had nothing more in the way of vehicles than a patrol wagon. Several citizens jumped in to help, and it was noted that accommodations offered by owners of automobiles afforded the officers the only chance of making a thorough search of the county. 11 automobiles owned by private citizens were pressed into service. Craig stopped to talk to his father, who took the pocket knife away from him and gave him some money. Craig then wandered through alleys and fields and eventually made his way to East Jackson Street, where he awaited a freight train. Unfortunately for him, the crew had been notified that he might try to jump into the train. He was spotted, the police were notified, and he was apprehended. Afterwards, Craig told a reporter, "I just gave myself up." About Dean, he said, "I didn't know that he was dead until about 15 minutes before they got me. I talked with some fellows up there and they told me about the fight. Of course, I didn't know anything about it, so I couldn't tell them anything." In other words, just deny, deny, deny. Earl Hopper didn't lead the police on quite the chase that Craig did. After separating from Craig, he went to his father's house on South Penn Street, where he was arrested about an hour after the murder. Less than a week later, a grand jury met to investigate the crime and to determine charges against Craig and Hopper. Approximately 20 people, many of whom were eyewitnesses to the murder, were called to testify. On Friday, August 13th, the grand jury charged Craig with first-degree murder and Hopper with assault and battery. It was noted in the newspaper that Craig made no remark but assumed that brave air that he has displayed since his arrest. The article also noted that Craig and Hopper will be arraigned today at Judge Ellis, as Judge Ellis desires to go on his vacation trip next Monday. The judge was also the victim's uncle. He was Frank Dean's uncle, but he did, even though he presided over the grand jury, he did recuse himself from presiding over the murder trial. Craig's trial was set for late September 1915. In a statement to the coroner, Craig said that Dean attempted to hit him with the pipe and then punched him in the eye. He then said that he got up and ran out of the room, but he did not mention stabbing Dean. Hopper, in his statement, said that he saw Craig stab Dean. Hopper's statement apparently influenced Dean then to plead self-defense for a crime that he denied committing. Jury selection was scheduled to begin in Delaware County on Monday, September 27th, 1915, from a pool of 60 men. Almost all of the prospective jurors indicated that they had a strong opinion as to Craig's guilt. A change of venue was requested and the trial was moved to Henry County, where a total of 10 attorneys, 5 on defense and 5 on prosecution, were engaged in the trial. The jury there consisted of 11 farmers and 1 insurance agent. All men, of course. With the jury finally selected, the trial began on November 10th, 1915. The testimony of eyewitnesses was convincing, and Craig was found guilty of second-degree murder. He showed no remorse and made several wild statements, including, "I don't give a damn, I will kill 4 or 5 more." Craig was sentenced to life in prison. On November 26, 1915, the Henry County Sheriff escorted him to the state penitentiary at Michigan City to begin his sentence. 7 years later, in January 1922, Indiana Governor McCrae commuted John Craig's sentence to 2 to 21 years based on his young age at the time of the murder and his exemplary behavior in prison. He was paroled after serving a little more than 7 years. What about Earl Hopper? In March 1916, he pled guilty to assault and battery, but that wasn't the end of that. The judge did not accept his plea and the case went back to the grand jury. And ultimately, he was charged with first-degree murder. On October 27th, 1916, after the jury deliberated for 42 hours, Hopper was acquitted. So what happened to the 2 of these men? And I was able to follow Hopper in the newspapers for a while. He seems to have continued a life of petty crime and appeared in the courts on a regular basis. Eventually, I didn't find anything more about him, so he must have either gone straight or moved away or died. And I'm going against the going straight. Sometime after his release from prison, John Craig moved to Jeffersonville, Indiana, where he married and later divorced. On May 13th, 1930, he shot and killed his ex-wife, May, and wounded her employer. He then turned the gun on himself. Craig joined his first victim, Frank Dean, in Beech Grove Cemetery. So this is the murder that first caught my attention, and it was the result of a festering grudge. On December 23rd, 1920, Hallett McHarg, age 30, walked into the corrugated paper room of the box factory at Ball Brothers and pulled out a Savage automatic revolver. McHarg looked at George Kling, said, "Hello, Dutch," and fired 2 shots at him. As Kling fell to the floor, he said, "Don't do that." McHarg walked over and fired at least 4 more shots into him. According to the newspaper account, after the final shot, Kling quivered slightly and was dead. The coroner's report noted that Kling had 12 wounds made by the entrance and exit of the bullets, including 7 holes in the liver, 3 in the stomach, and at least 1 in the heart. McHarg had only been in Muncie for about 3 or 4 months. He came from Medora, Indiana, where his parents, ex-wife, and current wife still lived. He first found a job at Hemingway Glass Company, but only worked there for about 3 weeks. After that, he went to work at Ball Brothers. There he worked catching labels as they came off the printing press in the corrugated paper room. He was a veteran of World War I and fought in Europe, and his military service factors in later in the story. The victim, George Kling, was 45 years old at the time of his death. He was a foreman of the women in the box making department. Kling was survived by his wife, Catherine, and their 2 children. After McHarg shot Kling, he instructed one of his coworkers to call the police. He then sat down and waited patiently for them to arrive. When they did so, he made a full confession stating, "After working there 2 or 3 weeks at Ball Brothers, George Kling, whom I shot and killed this morning, told Frank Arnold and some women who were working in the room with us that I was not fit to talk with women and for them not to talk with me. Frank Arnold and one of the women told me about this, and I went to Kling and asked him about it, and he told me to go to hell, and I hit him in the jaw. We had a fight then, and in the fight, Kling pulled out a knife and threatened to take my life." As to the events of that day, McHarg said, "This morning around 6:40 a.m., I walked into the room where I worked. George Kling was in there and I pulled out my revolver and shot him 4 or 5 times. He did not say a word to me before I shot him, but was looking towards me at the time I shot." On the next day, Christmas Eve, 1920, there was an editorial in the Muncie Evening Press advocating the death penalty for McHarg. It was noted that he deliberately sought out Kling and fired multiple shots into him. The murderer, the editorial noted, would have given as little consideration to a mad dog as he gave to this defenseless human victim. After McHarg was charged with first-degree murder by the Muncie City Court on December 28th, it appeared that he would probably plead insanity. The newspaper article stated that McHarg served overseas during the war and was gassed, shell-shocked, and wounded. Apparently, communications were received at the Delaware County Post of the American Legion stating that McHarg's insanity was the result of wounds received while fighting on the Argonne Front. He was returned to this country in shackles and was sent home to Medora in the care of an Army sergeant. McHarg's trial was set for May 1921, but was postponed to give the defense more time to prepare. The trial finally started on Monday, September 12th, 1921. By the following Saturday, the jury was in deliberation. The judge instructed the jury to find McHarg not guilty if they felt the murder was committed by a mentally unsound man. The prosecution, the judge said, wanted an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The defense advocated for a not guilty because of insanity decision, because McHarg's reason had been undermined by the insidious effects of gas. McHarg was convicted of murder in the first degree and given a life sentence. His defense team immediately began planning an appeal. Just a few weeks later, the defense presented the circuit court a list of 107 reasons why McHarg should be granted a new trial. And those reasons included that the court was in error for refusing the defendant's request for a change of venue, refusing to allow some witnesses to answer certain questions, and that the verdict was not sustained by sufficient evidence. McHarg waited for the decision in the prison at Michigan City. Indiana Supreme Court granted McHarg's appeal for a new trial, saying, among other things, that the judge erred in his instructions to the jury. The second trial began on Monday, January 7th, 1923. It was noted in the Muncie Evening Press that it is believed that the state will offer no great resistance to the attempt to have McHarg adjudged of unsound mind. The trial also ended that same day that it began. McHarg was judged insane and ordered to the State Institution for the Criminally Insane at Michigan City. It was intended that he be held there for life. But it wasn't for life. In April 1936, McHarg sought a court order declaring himself restored to sanity. A hearing was set for May 6th. McHarg's position was denied and he was returned to Michigan City. 2 years later, McHarg tried again, and in April 1938, he was declared cured of insanity. He was then released from the institution for the criminally insane because, according to the article in the Muncie Evening Press, the legal theory is that he committed no crime when he killed Kling because he was insane at that time, and his commitment was a safekeeping device. Howlett McHarg returned to Medora, joined the Bologna Christian Church, farmed for the rest of his life, and kept out of the news. He died in 1974. His obituary does not mention the 1920 murder. And this was the only picture I could find of McHarg in the middle holding a cigar, middle right holding a cigar. So these were two men with grudges and two murders. And these murders could have happened today just as easily as they happened 100 years ago. Things don't change. And I will turn you over now to Melissa Gentry.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks to everyone for coming. This is fun to be doing this in person, so that's really nice. I do have a disclaimer for my program. I did research on African Americans in the red light district of Muncie, and so some of the headlines may have language that you would not normally see today. So I just wanted to give you that warning. And I do want to say all of the photographs that I use in the program came from the digital media repository from the Ball State University Libraries. And all of the portraits that you'll see were done by an art student here at Ball State named Emma Lear. So I just want to give her credit for that. So this eerie story takes place in Prohibition era Muncie around 1916 in the red light district, which was centered on Walnut Street south of the railroad tracks that you see here. Muncie, like the rest of the country, was divided between wets and dries, who were people either pro or anti-prohibition. It was home to numerous, sometimes violent, literally explosive, campaigns and referenda regarding whether or not alcohol would be legal here. There were dozens of legitimate saloons in Muncie at this time. Even when alcohol consumption was legal, the city was also home to Blind Tigers, which were clubs operating without liquor licenses, in most cases with minority owners. The African American clubs and so-called immoral resorts were known as the Blue Front, thanks to the color of their doors. And this area was centered around Walnut Street and 2nd Street. But even these clubs stayed in business thanks to the bribery of police. Some officers were paid $100 in today's value per week per club owner. They would conduct raids from time to time just for show. Newspaper accounts satisfied the white society women who were concerned about vice, but also served as free advertising for new customers. In Muncie, sometimes called Little Chicago, and it actually kept that name into the 1970s, I discovered, corruption was widespread. One newspaper described it as corruption more lurid than sensational fiction. Even the prosecutor and the mayor were sent to prison during this era. At their trial in 1919, the judge declared, quote, "Muncie is very largely wicked," unquote. And a policeman testified that, quote, "there were blind tigers and houses of ill repute to be found every third door in the red light district," unquote. Not much is written at all, really, about women in the role of women during Prohibition. But life for women in the red light could definitely be eerie and very dangerous. Women during this time had very little rights. They couldn't yet vote. Many were dependent on men for survival. And as Becky mentioned before the program started, you can imagine some of the men in the red light district that they were depending on. This particular story doesn't have any ghosts, werewolves, or headless horsemen, but its main character is definitely a deadly monster. Tonight, we're taking a trip back to the dark red light district of Muncie to see what happened to women who were all connected to one particular African-American man named Frank, nicknamed Peanut Bass. Don't let the Peanut nickname fool you. He was a violent criminal, first referred to by newspapers as, quote, the bully of the red light, unquote, who later became known as the, quote, king of the red light district, unquote. Frank Bass was born around 1885 and began perpetrating petty crimes related to gambling and alcohol as a teenager in Muncie. He worked at a cigar store and eventually ran a pool hall / and I'm using air quotes, soft drink parlor called the 2nd Street Cabaret. He was a power broker who eventually hosted political parties in his home. But Frank left a trail of violence and tragedy in the red light. In 1903, Bass, at the age of 17, was arrested for the brutal assault of a man named Shug McCarty. He was arrested with 13 other men playing craps at a club on South Walnut on 4th of July weekend in 1904 and sent to the work farm. In 1905, Frank Bass was charged with assault and battery and provoke after violently beating and kicking Ella Rutherford, whom he seemed to be stalking. Provoke was a charge where a person causes someone to respond with violence in self-defense. What makes this incident more disturbing, Ella was reportedly only 13 years old, and Bass was acquitted. In 1906, Bass beat and kicked his sister Maud so brutally that he was sentenced to 30 days in jail. That sentence was notable since attacks on women rarely warranted stiff penalties. Another woman's connection to Frank Bass also spelled doom. That fall of 1906, a reported white woman named Grace Shoecraft was caught in a rear room of an African-American joint with Frank Bass, and both were charged with immorality. Grace was subsequently arrested for prostitution and intoxication on a number of occasions. In February of 1922, Grace Shoecraft died of chronic alcoholism at the age of 34. On her death certificate, her race was listed as white, but crossed out and marked, quote, colored, unquote. Frank Bass was working as a bartender at a club in 1907 when he sold liquor to a drunk man who then shot a man in the club. A month later, the newspapers reported that Bass brutally beat a man named Arthur Payton thrice, 3 times on the same day. In June of 1910, Frank Bass was arrested for assault and battery against his common-law wife, Mary. But the worst case related to Frank Bass and violence with women happened after the events beginning in 1914. Rose Proctor Henderson, originally from Washington, D.C. and age 24, had been living with Frank for at least 3 years, likely moving in after he assaulted his wife, Mary. That March, Rose and Frank began fighting during a dance at Franklin Hall on Mulberry Street. Their commotion drew the attention of onlookers outside and police were called, and Frank and Rose were both arrested. Frank called Rose his housekeeper, but she considered herself a common-law wife, just as Mary had before. Reports of abuse were well known, but like most women of that time, Rose was stuck. Distraught and desperate, Rose at first drank poison, trying to end her life, but was unsuccessful. Then at a party at the Bass home in December of 1915, Rose pulled Frank's revolver out of her pocket and shot herself in the heart right in front of shot friends. Earlier that year, in February of 1915, another incident in the red light district would later connect to Frank Bass. One Saturday night, a group of women began rioting at a party. The Muncie Star reported this about one of the attendees, Ruby Leota McCrae. Quote, about midnight, the party changed into a riot, with the McCrae woman hitting right and left because of alleged smiles tendered her husband by other women, unquote. On Sunday morning, Ruby was lying in wait for one of the women allegedly flirting with her husband, Pearl Woods, on 2nd Street as Pearl walked to the inner urban station. Quote, without warning, it is said Ruby McCray pulled a knife and made a slash at the Woods woman, unquote. Ruby was using a corn knife that cut through clothing and a corset with a gash 5 inches long over the hip. Bystanders intervened, but Woods continued on to the station to meet her friends and arrived bleeding profusely. Ruby was arrested for assault, but the victim, Pearl, and 2 others were arrested for rioting. Fresh from her divorce from her flirting husband, Ruby McCray moved in with, you guessed it, Frank Bass, as his housekeeper / common law wife. Ruby later described how Frank enticed her in a less than romantic manner. Quote, after Rose Proctor, who was Peanut's woman, killed herself, Frank told me that I was to cook his meals and live with him, unquote. The cycle of abuse and violence with Frank Bass, unsurprisingly, did not change. He kicked and beat Ruby, and she regularly sought treatment at home hospital. But like the women who came before, Ruby was powerless. Meanwhile, just down 2nd Street, a rare woman with independence and power also succumbed to the violence of the red light district. Denver, Colorado, nicknamed Collie Cook, has to be the best name in the history of Muncie. She was operating a blind tiger / gambling club / immoral resort with another African-American woman named Eliza Hughes, though Collie listed her own occupation as a domestic for the census. The 2 women were extremely wealthy, even hiring white Muncie police officers to run liquor from Kentucky and to work as bartenders and bouncers at their club. In the fall of 1919, Collie Cook engaged in a heated argument with her boyfriend at Frank Bass's cabaret on 2nd Street. After her beau slapped Collie, she told her boyfriend Louis Watson, who had been working at her club, to get out of her house and her life. Watson began stalking Cook, trying to win back her love, but Cook remained strong. Collie and Eliza's wealth provided them independence, but it did not ensure them safety. On Thursday, October 9th, 1919, Collie Cook was walking with Nora Hill down 1st Street when they passed Louis Watson. He tried to stop Collie to talk, but she said she didn't have time for him. So Watson opened fire, shooting Collie Cook at least 4 times in the back. The Muncie Star reported, quote, jealousy prompted by anger, which is said to have arisen yesterday morning when the woman refused to return some personal property to Watson, is thought by police to have caused the shooting. Actually, and in fact, a scorned Louis Watson caused the shooting. Watson's defense was the old, she had it coming excuse. In a jail cell interview, he blamed Collie for her own shooting. In court, Watson explained, quote, I didn't murder her, I just shot her and she died afterwards. It was her fault that she's dead tonight and her fault that I'm behind bars, unquote. And as an added emphasis on the treatment of especially African-American women in the red light district, Nora Hill, who witnessed that murder of her friend Collie Cook, was also detained in jail for weeks as a witness to the crime. Then in late 1920, the red light district of Muncie was hit by a climactic storm worthy of a motion picture. Federal agents swept into the city in a real-life dragnet, making arrests in a huge nationwide ring related to liquor and gambling. It was one of the biggest busts in the country under the newly enacted prohibition laws, which began that January of 1920. City officials had once again been implicated, along with proprietors of pool halls, cigar stands, and other clubs. Among the defendants were, quote, 2 local attorneys, a police captain, a Warner Gear executive, a police officer, a justice of the peace, and 2 constables, unquote. Collie Cook's partner, Eliza Hughes, went on the lam and was later captured in Chicago. And Frank Peanut Bass, king of the red light, was finally arrested. After 2 decades of assault, King Bass was in real trouble from the feds for illegal gambling. Unfortunately, though, for Ruby McCrae, Frank's reckless behavior was unaffected. In January of 1921, after his arrest in that prohibition ring, but before his sentencing, Frank went out on the town with a woman from Indianapolis after first bringing her by his house and delivering some orders for chores to Ruby. When it got to be late, Ruby engaged in a humiliating search for her husband at his favorite haunts around Muncie. She found Frank in bed with another woman at a friend's home. After being warned not to, quote, make trouble, Ruby headed upstairs. Frank emerged from the room, quote, clothed only in his underwear and a pair of trousers when she told him to put some clothes on and come home, unquote. When he tried to kick Ruby down the stairs, she pulled a gun from her coat pocket and shot him dead. She called the police to confess when she got home. The headline read, quote, King of the Red Light District shot by housekeeper early today, claims self-defense. Frank Bass was 36 and his obituary was published on the front page of the newspaper in a place of prominence like a pillar of the community. The monster of this movie, responsible for a lifetime of hateful threats, violent abuse, even against his sister and wives, and the humiliating degradation of women, had met a tragic end. But as we've witnessed in so many Halloween movies, the monster never really dies. And and I did want to mention, if you want to learn what happens to Ruby McCrae, Dr. Jennifer De Silva, she's a history professor here at Ball State, and her students have done further research on Ruby, and they created some videos. If you just Google Town on Fire, Ball State University, you can look at several videos about some of the women that we've researched, and one of them is Ruby McCrae.
Well, okay, thank you, everybody. Those were great stories to hear right before Halloween. We're gonna open it up to questions. So I think, I'm not sure, we haven't tried this. We have a wireless mic that we can walk around if people have questions. Just raise your hand. I was making sure it didn't like provide any feedback or anything. And if anyone on Zoom wants to ask a question, they can use the chat. Anybody? Oh, over here. Okay.
I have a question for Sara. You mentioned that the person who only lasted one day in the haunted house, their last name was McKinley. Any relation to you?
So the question was if I'm related to Tom McKinley, who only lasted a day. As far as I know, I'm not related. My family, I haven't found my ties to Delaware County yet, but I kind of wondered when I looked at that too.
Any other questions? Anybody on Zoom? I just want to give everyone a chance if they've got questions. Okay, well, we want to promote some other events that we have coming up. Melissa, did you want to talk about this one? Sure.
So the next event at the EB Ball Center is Tuesday, November 1st at 10 o'clock. It's some maps that I made about suffrage history in Muncie. If you're interested in that, you can call Diane and sign up.
And I was chosen to promote this last program because I can pronounce the name of the architect in this program, which is Kuno Kibley. The program is called He Built This City, the Muncie Architecture of Kuno Kibley. Kuno actually, he and his architecture firm were responsible for a lot of the buildings that you're familiar with in Muncie. And so that presentation will actually be November 29th at Bracken Library, room 104. And the presenters of that will be Melissa, myself, and Cody Sprunger, who is the librarian at the Architecture Library for Ball State. So if you are interested in that, we'll be at Bracken on November 29th. And I think that was our last slide. So thank you all for coming tonight.